All right. Well, shalom, everyone. So delighted that we're all together for Mark Ashley's talk this evening about Megillat Esther as political drama. Is the diaspora good or bad for the Jews? So, just with great gratitude to Mark, even before he begins, I'm sure we'll have more afterwards. The power of getting together on the holidays and learning has become part of our custom around here. The learning with Mark that he's done for the holidays, in addition to his springtime classes. So really, grateful that you prepared this lecture pre-perm to give us some deeper sense of the Megillah, because we want to get the whole Megillah. Just had to get that in there. Had to. And so this is definitely a traditional part of Judaism to attach these ideas together. But, two classic questions. Is the book political, and is the diaspora good or bad for the Jews? I'll put that out there at the beginning, Mark, to say, do you think it really was political of a choice in terms of the canonization? Maybe you'll address that, maybe you won't during the talk, but maybe afterwards. And then, this question is a burning one in today's world where we have the land and state of modern Israel and the ability to travel back and forth. So these are such relevant questions for our time. And without any further ado, I'll pass it on to you. Thanks again. And Helene, can you pin Mark's picture, and everybody with their view just choose the single frame view when Helene pins Mark, and you'll have Mark's center screen.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for attending. I'm glad we can hold Zoom lectures in this in the chilly winter weather we've been having. The Rabbi just broached some of the issues that I'll be addressing, and I'm going to give my talk and then leave time afterwards for comments and questions. So if you have them along the way, please save them. I'm going to share my source sheet right away. Okay, so I hope everyone can now see my source sheet. The Rabbi already mentioned the title, and I think it's an appropriate title, and I hope to address the issues that are embedded within it. But let me start with a confession. My confession is that I have always been struck by what I perceive as a disconcerting disconnect, I'll call it, at the heart of our observance of Purim, that we celebrate quite raucously, and some of us even celebrate drunkenly. But I have always felt that sometimes mindless frivolity and revelry is generally quite inconsistent with the seriousness and trauma that is at the core of the book of Esther, of Megillat Esther. So just a quick reminder, I'm not going to summarize the story in any detail, just a quick reminder about the story at that the Megillah embodies, and that really is the most important ritual of our observance of the holiday. Through a combination of shrewd actions by Mordechai and Esther, on the one hand, and on the other hand, some cosmically favorable coincidences of events, the Jews of the Persian Empire, sometime in the 5th century BCE, so several centuries before the Common Era, were rescued and saved from utter destruction and annihilation. That is, I think we should keep in mind, at the core of the story of Megillat Esther was the very, very real threat of genocide of the Jews. So we have a genocidal story that we're reading, and to me, that seems incompatible to some degree with the revelry that we celebrate Purim with, and we can talk about that. But I think that the story itself, even though there's some people read it somewhat comedically, I think reflects very serious and important themes about the reality of Jewish life in the diaspora, about Jewish identity. And I think it's clear that the ambiance of the book, seen in the light in which I just described it, is really a very dark world in which Jews exist at the edge of an abyss, I would call it. And I think it's within that setting that Megillat Esther should be understood and appreciated as a story of Jews very gingerly but tactically navigating the fraught and fragile circumstances of life in what was then an all-encompassing Persian Empire. And I'll talk a little bit about that context. But as the rabbi suggested, I think Megillat Esther has a lot to tell and to teach us about Jewish identity in a complicated world, and about living in a diaspora in which all of us do, outside of our people's homeland in Israel, when that, especially in this contemporary world, in our circumstances, when that is a deliberative and consequential choice. We all have the option. I mean, most of us have some option of moving to Israel if we want it. But we're having this lecture in the diaspora. I think Megillat Esther has a lot to teach us about that. So I've already confessed that I think there's a problematic disconnect at the heart of our observance of Purim, and I'm not the first person to think that. So starting with my first source from Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, is it an exaggeration to see in celebration of Purim a substratum of despair? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow Mordechai may be hanged and a new Haman may be enthroned. So I start there because I think that's really captures an important essence of the story, that but for some really strategic politics and some very good luck, Jewish history could have ended during the course of the events that Megillat Esther describes. I think Rabbi Greenberg's comment really captures the fragility and capriciousness of our life in the diaspora. Moving on, I always think it's good to cite Maimonides. Maimonides, interestingly, in his great code of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, juxtaposes the laws of Purim, of Megillat Esther, and of Hanukkah. He didn't have to do that. I think he did it strategically. And it is interesting because, as we'll discuss, I think Hanukkah really embodies sort of Zionist themes that I think are largely absent from Megillat Esther. So Purim and Hanukkah, I think, really have competing perspectives on Jewish identity, on Jewish history, on the Jewish future. So, but Maimonides put them together, and at the end of this section of his code, he writes, all prophetic books and the sacred writings will cease to be recited in public during the Messianic era, except the book of Esther, except Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther, will continue to exist just as the 5 books of the Torah and the laws of the oral Torah that will never cease. Although ancient troubles will be remembered no longer, and he cites a verse from Isaiah, the days of Purim will not be abolished as it is written. And then he cites a verse from near the end of Megillat Esther. So I don't think, by the way, he's codifying an opinion from the Jerusalem Talmud. This is not a self-evident or inevitable conclusion that Purim, of all the holidays, will have some existence in the Messianic period, whereas other Jewish holidays or books relating to those holidays will fade away with regular history having been concluded. And Maimonides does not make clear why that is the case. I'll suggest briefly, and this is something perhaps we can discuss as well at the end. I think he may believe that Purim reflects Jewish adaptability, Jewish resilience on the one hand, and importantly, on the other hand, God's universalism, that in the book of Esther, to the extent, and we're going to discuss this in some detail, to the extent that God was involved at all in the events of Megillat Esther, God can be seen as universalistic, that God operated outside the land of Israel, that God's concern for the Jews and for Jewish welfare was equally accessible in the diaspora and was not confined to the land of Israel. But I think it's interesting that Maimonides suggests that Purim, of all the Jewish holidays, will have some enduring quality to it within the Messianic period. Okay, I want to set sort of the historical context a bit for our discussion. And this first text is Psalm 137. The context of this psalm is after the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE. This was written at some point soon after the Judeans. So I won't call them Jews, and that's an important distinction. They were obviously the predecessors of Jews, but they were the Jews of Judea, of the southern kingdom of Judah, who were by the way, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel had already been both exiled and really annihilated. They were dispersed and never came back into existence. But this psalm is about the feelings of those who were exiled in Babylonia. These are famous words that we say on Tisha B'Av, Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. And the captors want them to sing songs about Zion, but the psalm says, how can we sing a song of God on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. So these are famous words that we still say today. And there's a real sense of lament, of despair, of desolation, and devastation at having been exiled from the Jewish homeland. And importantly, theologically, at the time, exile from the land was seen as a sign of punishment by God, as a reflection of God's unhappiness, God's displeasure, God's disfavor of the Jews because of the Jewish sins of idolatry and other significant sins that led to God being displeased. That's how Jews understood their exile at the time, that if they were in exile, it meant that God was unhappy with them and they could only hope to be returned to their homeland. So the question I want to raise in connection with Megillat Esther, which is a story about Jewish diaspora, written in the Jewish diaspora. And here's a little bit of historical context. I mentioned the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE. The Babylonians were subsequently defeated and conquered by the Persians, and in 539, bringing all Jews in the world, so every Jew in the world, came under the control of the Persian Empire. And Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, very graciously in his tolerance allowed all exiled Jews the option to return to Judea in the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. So the first temple had been destroyed. Cyrus said, you Jews can return, you Judeans can return to the land of Israel and build the temple all over again. But the reality is that after Cyrus's proclamation of tolerance, most Jews decided, either voluntarily or otherwise, to live outside of Judea, not to return to their homeland, and to stay in the diaspora. Megillat Esther, as I mentioned, was written in the diaspora, in the ancient Persian Empire, sometime well into the 2 century period of the rule of the Persian Empire. And that too is significant. The Persian Empire lasted a long time. The sense within the Megillah is that there was no clear indication of when the Persian Empire might dissipate to allow Jews to have autonomy again. And the question is, why didn't more Jews return to the homeland? Even our Tanakh makes clear that it was a minority of Jews who returned to Judea to rebuild the temple. It wasn't a particularly enthusiastic rebuilding. There were problems. So my question is, why are there still Jews living in the diaspora at the time of Megillat, the events of Megillat Esther, when decades earlier they all could have returned to their homeland? And theologically, did those Jews believe that those Jews who did not return and remained in the diaspora, did they still believe that they were in divine exile, that God was still somehow displeased with them, remaining within the diasporic lands of the Persian Empire, as opposed to returning from where they had come decades earlier? That's an open question about whether the Jews generally thought they were still in exile. I think it's clear that the people or person who wrote Megillat Esther did not believe that they were still living in an unfavorable exile as opposed to diaspora. I'm distinguishing between those two words. One can distinguish it within Hebrew between galut, exile, and golah, diaspora. And I think the people who wrote Megillat Esther and the theology that it reflects about the diaspora is that it was perfectly fine to have remained in the diaspora and not to have returned to the homeland. I want to really outline how anomalous, how unusual Megillat Esther is within our Bible, within our Tanakh. I've bulleted a number of ways in which Megillat Esther is highly unusual, and I think it reflects what I just described, this transition from Jews feeling, at least the Jews whose perspective is captured by Megillat Esther, they believe that they were in diaspora and no longer in exile, and that it was a respectable and theologically viable option to remain there. Here are some of the oddities of Megillat Esther that I'm going to discuss that I think reflect the diaspora perspective that it was advancing. There is famously, or infamously, depending on your perspective, not a single reference in the Megillah to God. And I write virtually unique in Tanakh because I think the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, is similar, although it is read to be very religious in nature. But Megillat Esther does not have any reference to God. Well, I'm going to discuss what I think is maybe an oblique reference, but indisputably, there's no explicit reference to God in the book of Esther. Importantly, there's not a single mention of or any, not even just mention, any sense of awareness of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Second Temple by then had been rebuilt and was standing for decades by the time the events of Megillat Esther were thought to have taken place. There is no sense at all of a connection to the dynasty of King David, which is really a bedrock principle in Jewish thought in other books of the biblical canon. And in fact, in contrast to other biblical books, Mordechai, one of the two heroes of the Megillah, is actually related to King Saul, and who was King David's sort of rival, and not to any descendants of the Davidic dynasty. As we'll discuss, there were very limited associations in the book with Jewish law, piety, prayers, any sort of Jewish practice. Importantly, without any compunction or any self-consciousness about doing so, Mordechai encourages Esther to try to marry the king and thereby engage in intermarriage with a non-Jewish king. There's no sense of that the Megillah thinks that is behavior that should be condemned. Mordechai does it without compunction. And I ask, how did Esther keep kosher as queen? It seems like a funny question, but we'll see. It's actually not a trivial issue. There's no sense that in as queen of Persia, in the palace, Esther either was able to keep kosher or had any interest in keeping kosher. Very importantly, as we'll discuss, there's no focus in the book at all. So no, not explicitly or even, I would say implicitly, no focus on any allegiance to or sense of wanting to return to the land of Israel. And as we'll see, there were some variants, some textual variants of the book of Esther written in Greek that make the Megillah much more religious in nature, that make it much more compatible with the other books in the biblical canon. But I think all of these unusual, these oddities of the Megillah relative to other books in the Bible are related to its diaspora perspective. The book of Megillat Esther is so unusual within the Torah that the rabbis, I think, of the rabbis of the Talmud, so again, just to make sure everyone is on the same historical page as I am, the rabbis of the Talmud here are centuries after both the events and the composition of the book of Esther. The rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud write, Esther min ha-Torah minayin. Where in the Torah can we find any allusion to or even sort of a hint of the events of Purim? And they cite a verse from the book of Deuteronomy, V'anochi haster astir panai bayom hahu. God says in Deuteronomy, I will hide my face on that day because of all the evil he's predicting, God is predicting the Israelites will engage in after they enter the promised land. And this is more, I think this is sometimes taught as, oh, it's sort of a funny pun on the word, on the name of Esther, Haster, Astir, sounds like Esther. By the way, I'll note, the name Esther is not a Jewish name, even though now many Jewish girls are named Esther. It's actually either a Babylonian or Persian name in origin. Esther's Hebrew name in the Megillah is Hadassah, but she's known by her non-Jewish name. But I think this is more than just a pun. I think it's important in at least two ways. The rabbis thought the book of Esther was so anomalous within the biblical canon, so problematic, actually, theologically and religiously and spiritually, that they needed to find biblical license, biblical authorization, a biblical rationale for inclusion of the book within the canon, and they found it in this verse. And so the Torah, if the Torah said, oh, it's okay, there's going to be a book of Esther, that Deuteronomy is telling us there'll be a book of Esther in the future, it's okay to embrace it despite its oddities. And in addition, the rabbis, in just a few words, are telling us what the theology of the book of Esther is, despite its plain meaning, with not a single reference to God. The rabbis in the Talmud are trying to instruct us, and I don't know, I think this is not the pshat, the plain meaning of the book, but they're trying to tell us that the implicit theology of the book is that God is hidden. God is not totally absent. God is behind the scenes, as we'll discuss. Now, there is some precedent, some limited precedent, I would say, for this diasporic perspective in the Megillah, and the sort of foreign nature of the book in terms of how odd it is with respect to certain factors that would merit inclusion in the biblical canon. The book of Jeremiah has some very important lines here, and I write, from Judaism to Judaism. So remember, when the Jews were exiled by the Babylonians, the only place that, I'll call them Jews, the only place that Jews had been living until that time was in Judea. They had been living in the northern kingdom as well, but a century earlier, they were exiled and essentially removed from the world by the Assyrians. And so there was a transition from Judea-focused religion. So Judaism was focused both geographically and religiously on Jerusalem, on the temple, on the land of Judea. And over time, it became what we now call Judaism. And that's different. There was no longer an exclusive focus on the geographical land of a part of the land of Israel based in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah in this chapter says, and he's conveying what God says. Thus said God of hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community that I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. So he's telling the Jews now exiled in Babylonia, build houses and live in them in Babylonia, meaning plant gardens and eat their fruit. You should take wives and beget sons and daughters, marry those children, multiply there, do not decrease. And importantly, seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you and pray to God in its behalf. Ki vishloma yeh lachem shalom, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. That's an important perspective, that where Jews end up in the diaspora, Jews there should pray for the prosperity of those countries that provided them refuge, or in which they find themselves, even if they were not happily relocated there. But I would say that this perspective of Jeremiah that's reiterated in Megillat Esther is really a sort of a minority perspective in Jewish thought. And the dominant majority perspective is captured in all sorts of sources. I've just selected a few. This is from the book of Ezekiel that talks about a second Exodus. So this is again after the Babylonian exile. And Ezekiel is imagining that God will perform a second Exodus that in many ways, based on Ezekiel's description, might be even greater than the first. Ezekiel writes, as I live, declares the Lord God, I will reign over you with a strong hand. This is all language that is evocative of the book of Exodus. I will reign over you with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm and with overflowing fury, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's very much Exodus language. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you are scattered. When I bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands in which you are scattered, I will accept you as a pleasing odor. I will be sanctified through you. Then when I have brought you to the land of Israel, to the country that I swore to give to your ancestors, you shall know that I am God. So this perspective of return to the homeland. So again, the exile reflected God's displeasure with our sins. But Ezekiel and many other sources within the biblical canon imagine a return, that God will engineer a return of the exiled Jews to the homeland. That's really the dominant perspective. Megillat Esther, I think, is a sort of caveat, an exception to that biblical perspective. And again, this perspective of this sort of, I'll call it's a modern term, but a more Zionist perspective of a focus on returning to our homeland is all over the place in our sacred literature, including in our liturgy, which I know I've said this before, but if you want to know what Jews think, open up the Siddur, and during Shabbat Shachrit Amidah, we sing, and we say, from your place, our King, you will appear. This is sometime in the future, and reign over us, for we await you. When will you reign in Zion? Let it be soon in our time, forever may you dwell there. You will be exalted and sanctified within Jerusalem, your city. So again, a focus not just on the homeland generally, but on Jerusalem for all generations and for all eternity. And also a focus on the kingship, the enduring and eternal kingship of King David. May our eyes behold your kingship as it is described in the Psalms of David, the anointed one of your righteousness. Again, I could have chosen many passages from our liturgy, but here's another very important one during our festival, Musaf Amidah, that we say on the three major pilgrimage holidays. Umipnei, and this is a very important theme. I'm going to talk about this theme in my spring class this year. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land and made distant from our soil. And we sing to God, unite our scattered people from among the nations and gather our dispersed from the ends of the earth. Lead us with song to Zion, your city, with everlasting joy to Jerusalem, your sanctuary. So in many parts of our davening and in many books of our biblical canon is this generally the majority perspective that Jews in the diaspora wanted to return to the homeland at some point in the future, with God's help. That, again, I'm calling it anachronistically Zionist thinking, endured for centuries. Here's an example from the medieval period. Yehuda Levi, great Jewish thinker in Spain in the 12th century, in what we think of as the golden age of Spain, and he rose to great heights in various aspects of his life. But he wrote this very poignant poem. My heart is in the east, toward Israel, and I am at the ends of the west. How can I taste what I eat, and how can it be pleasing to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds while yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom? And I think he was referring to the Christians there. And I, in Spain, am in the chains of Arabia under Muslim rule. And he writes, I'd gladly leave behind me all the pleasures of Spain, if only I might see the dust and ruins of your sanctuary, of your temple. So for many, many centuries, and it obviously extended beyond Halevi to the centuries into the modern period, Jews, the majority of time, were praying and hoping deeply for a return to their homeland in Israel. So these are sources that capture the anomalous quality of the Megillah, which has no focus at all on a return to the promised land. It seems to be fully and comfortably embedded in the diaspora, with a sense that Jews, yes, some Jews might live back in Judea, but we Jews in the Persian Empire, have no reason or interest to leave the diaspora to try to return to the homeland. Turning to the perspective of God within the diaspora as captured by the Megillah. God, in the Megillah, God is only at best indirectly, obliquely, ambiguously referenced. And so that goes to how Jews were navigating religiously in the Megillah. I'm sorry, in the diaspora. The Megillah here, this is really, I think, the sort of best oblique reference to God. It's maybe the most important passage in the Megillah. It says, when Mordechai was told what Esther had said, this follows when Mordechai told Esther, you've got to try to save us. Haman has this evil plan to exterminate all of us. Esther, you as queen you're in position to save us. And Esther said, oh, I can't really be of help because I can only see the king, and that was the source of political access to power. I can only see the king when the king asks for my presence, and he hasn't done so for 30 days. And when Mordechai was told that was Esther's response, Mordechai sent back this message to Esther. Do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. It's a harsh message. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. And the Hebrew here, umi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamalchut. That's, I think we should take seriously those words. And who knows, umi yodea. Mordechai is not sure of where, how this is going to, the Jews' welfare is going to work out if Esther doesn't step in and intervene on their behalf. And I've always thought this is a somewhat surprising passage and a surprising message from Mordechai, because Mordechai seems to reflect the faith that if Esther doesn't intervene, that somehow um, salvation will come from another source. It's certainly not clear to me what the alternative to Esther's intervention is, what Mordecai may have thought he had in his back pocket, what his backup plan was if Esther continued to resist intervention. But Mordecai does reflect some element of faith that salvation will come from elsewhere. Again, notably, God's name is not mentioned here, where a reader of the Jewish Bible would think that this is a place where God's name would be mentioned, that deliverance would be referenced in explicit connection to God, and it's not. So I describe this as only, at best, at maximum, an oblique reference to God's presence, certainly not an explicit presence. And I want to contrast that perspective of the sort of non-apparent presence of God in the diaspora with another or two books in the Tanakh, Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're referred to really as Ezra in rabbinic literature. But Ezra and Nehemiah, those were books that reflect events that were really contemporaneous with those in Megillat Esther, that happened at about the same time in the setting of the Persian Empire. But Ezra and Nehemiah, those books in the Jewish Bible reflect a much different perspective. Ezra, the book of Ezra, starts out, the first verse starts, in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, when the word of God spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, God roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus said, and they're putting words in King Cyrus's mouth. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the eternal God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building a house of God in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So not only, according to the book of Ezra, again, in contrast to Megillat Esther, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, not only is God sort of the puppeteer of King Cyrus of Persia, the most powerful person in the world. So God is behind the scenes engineering and orchestrating what this foreign leader is doing. But the foreign leader himself, King Cyrus of Persia, seems to recognize the Jewish God, and that Jewish God has given him the mandate to assist in the rebuilding of the temple. That stands in stark contrast to the Megillah. Elsewhere, further on in Ezra, it says, for slaves we are, though even in our bondage, so in exile, God has not forsaken us, but has disposed the king of Persia favorably toward us to furnish us with sustenance and to raise again the house of our God, repairing its ruins and giving us a hold in Judah and Jerusalem. So the perspective of Ezra, it's a much more nationalistic, much more Judea-focused, non-diaspora perspective. And within this more conventional perspective, and again, Megillat Esther sort of bucks the conventional wisdom in the Jewish Bible more generally. In Ezra, God is orchestrating everything and predisposed the king of Persia to allow the Jews to return to Judea and to rebuild the temple. Much different perspective from Megillat Esther. And again, Megillat Esther is really the minority perspective with its very sort of intense and even unself-conscious focus on a diaspora perspective that really excludes the hyperactive presence of God in Jewish life. Again, if you turn to our prayer book, our liturgy, the more conventional, the more traditional perspective becomes clear. We say, in this Al Hanisim prayer that we say both for Purim and Hanukkah, it's the introduction is the same, but then the details about the two holidays are separate. We say for the miracles and for the redemption, for the mighty acts and for the salvation and for the wars that you, God, have done for our forefathers in those days in this season. And it goes on to describe what Mordecai and Esther did. and we say, "Ve'ata b'rachamecha rabim," etc. But you, God, in your abundant mercy, nullified his counsel. So you, God, nullified and mooted the plans of the evil Haman, frustrated his intention, and brought his evil plan upon his own head. So our prayers in elsewhere, but most sort of perhaps most famously in this Al Hanisim prayer, which the rabbis advocated and championed, the Al Hanisim prayer makes clear that traditional Jews for many centuries after the composition of Megillat Esther have thought that God was really behind the scenes in orchestrating everything that happened in the Megillah, despite the absence of the name of God in the book. And the rabbis made this theology very clear in an interesting way. This is from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Megillah. It says right at the beginning of chapter 3 of the Megillah, after these events, King Achashverosh promoted Haman. And so the Gemara in the Talmud asks, after what particular events? What is the Megillah referring to? And right before that, if you look at the Megillah at the end of chapter 2, that's where it notes that Mordechai overheard the assassination plot against King Achashverosh, reported it to Esther. Esther reported that to Achashverosh in Mordechai's name. Mordechai got credit for it. Mordechai was recorded in the annals of the king. That's what the king chapters later read when he couldn't sleep and said, "Oh, this Mordechai guy, was he ever rewarded for intervening on my behalf?" And they said no. So the Talmud says, Rava said, only after the Holy One, blessed be, created a remedy for the ailment. So Rava is saying God, orchestrating all these events and orchestrating the salvation of the Jews, created the fix for the problem before the problem was set in motion. So Mordechai, overhearing the assassination plot, finding favor in the eyes of the king by saving his life, that had to precede the promotion of evil Haman. And this goes to a more general principle, as Reish Lakish said, the Holy One, blessed be he, does not strike at the Jewish people unless he, God, has already created a remedy for them beforehand. So that's the Talmudic rabbinic perspective, that God, if there's ever a terrible crisis that the Jews face, God has already implanted within the historical scheme some way for the Jews to be saved. That's what happened in the Megillah, that Mordechai is finding favor in the eyes of the king was already set in motion before the evil decree of Haman started to materialize. And it's an important theological principle that God always orchestrates a source and manner of salvation for us. Let me turn to the issue of navigating ritually in the diaspora, as reflected in the Megillah. And again, this is here's a source: keeping kosher in a diaspora palace. This is not a trivial issue, and it's not self-evident that Esther couldn't keep kosher in the palace. The Megillah tells us, and this is before she was elevated to be queen, the maiden, meaning Esther, pleased the head of the harem and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with her cosmetics and her rations, as well as with the 7 maids who were going to help her. And he treated them kindly because the head of the harem liked Esther. And the Hebrew is ve'et manoteha. There's no sense that she got any different food than the other girls, the other virgins who were brought to the harem for inspection by King Achashverosh. So there's no sense that before she became queen or during her tenure as queen of Persia, Esther kept the laws of kashrut. That is in stark contrast to another book in the Bible, the book of Daniel, in which almost immediately the credentials, the traditional credentials of Daniel are established. It says Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. Daniel was also, like Mordecai, a courtier in, I think, both the Babylonian and Persian courts. So he's a parallel figure to Mordecai, but is depicted very differently from the world of the diaspora reflected in the Megillah. Um, Daniel did not want to eat non-kosher food, so he sought permission of the chief officer not to defile himself, and God disposed the chief officer to be kind and compassionate toward Daniel, gave him vegetarian food. So Daniel, one might think, oh, Esther had no option to try to keep kosher in the palace. Well, another sort of competing book of the Jewish canon tells us that another of our heroes, Daniel, actually went out of the way to avoid eating tray food when he was in the non-Jewish palace. So within the broader perspective of the Jewish Bible, it is an option to keep kosher in a diaspora palace. Another example of reflecting diasporic politics in the Megillah is whether prayer is required as part of a response to Jewish crisis. I think many readers of the Megillah think sort of perfunctorily, oh, when the Jews, when they fasted and the response to the crisis of learning about evil Haman's plan was that they put on sackcloth, pursuant to the instructions of Esther. Esther said to Mordecai, "Go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe that same fast. Then I shall go to the king, and if I perish because I wasn't called in advance by the king, I'll perish. But I'm going to go through with this effort to intervene on behalf of my people." They fast, they put on sackcloth, but there's no indication. And I would say that it's a purposeful omission. It's not inadvertent. There's no mention that they prayed to God. Whereas, if you contrast the Megillah to another book in the Jewish Bible, Joel says, "Make sacred a fast, proclaim an assembly, gather the elders in the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. V'za'aku el Hashem." Here is an explicit mention of God's name, an explicit reference to not just crying out, because the Jews in the Megillah do cry out, but there's no indication that they cry out to God, which is a very interesting and I would think actually purposeful omission, reflecting the perspective of the book, that God was there was Jews the Jews who wrote the Megillah and the events that it purports to describe didn't know whether God was going to intervene on their behalf. They were left to their own devices. Other books of the Bible make clear, if you're going to fast, if you're going to put on sackcloth, you also have to engage in some davening, some praying and crying out to God. The rabbis, again, centuries later, the rabbis of the Talmud, with respect to all these ways in which both Mordecai and Esther in the Megillah are not particularly religious Jews. They don't seem to have any interest in Jewish practice or Jewish piety. I think they're loyal Jews, but the traditional, conventional ways that in other books of the Bible that Jews displayed their loyalty to the Jewish God are absent from the Megillah. But the rabbis of the Talmud wanted to sort of normalize the Megillah and normalize Esther and make her more of a sort of biblical heroine that we could that they wanted us to emulate. So they had to make her more frum, more religious. So in the Babylonian Talmud, it says, we just heard about them, the 7 maids that were given to Esther to help her prepare for her encounter with King Achashverosh. So she had 7 of them. That was what she was allotted. Rava said, this is in the Babylonian Talmud, Esther would have a separate maid attend her each day, and she would count the days of the week by them, so she was always aware when Shabbat was. So all of a sudden, as depicted in the Talmud, Esther is observing Shabbat in the palace. There's no evidence of that according to the plain meaning of the Megillah. The verse continues, and he advanced her and her maids to the best place in the house of the women. Rav said what those words mean is that the head of the harem fed Esther her food of Jews. So Rav believes that Esther kept kosher in the palace, and the Megillah is telling us that very obliquely, but telling us that based on his interpretation of the words of the Megillah, that she kept kosher. Shmuel says no, the advancement was a well-intentioned act in that he fed her pig hinds, thinking she would view it as a delicacy, but they weren't kosher. So Rav thinks that Esther kept kosher. Shmuel says no, she was essentially coerced into eating non-kosher food. And then, even more interestingly, Rabbi Yochanan said that the head of the harem gave Esther vegetables. And as we know, vegetables are not problematic in terms of laws of keeping kosher. And how does Rabbi Yochanan know that Esther was given vegetables when it doesn't say that in the Megillah? He cites a verse from Daniel, very ironically, because Daniel's a much more sort of religious book than the Megillah. And he cites the parallel verse in Daniel where it says the steward took away their non-kosher food and gave Daniel and his colleagues vegetables, which they could eat without violating the laws of kashrut. So sort of unselfconsciously, Rabbi Yochanan is using a proof text from another book of the Bible that has a very different perspective about Jewish ritual practice in the diaspora than does Megillat Esther. But the rabbis wanted and needed to make Esther a much more conventional biblical heroine who, behind the scenes, within the palace confines, was observing Jewish halakha, Jewish ritual practice in various ways. Very interestingly, I don't know if people have thought about this, but because there's no explicit connection between Passover and Purim in the Megillah, but if you read the Megillah, it says that these events relating to Haman's plan, and when Mordechai learns about the plan and then appeals to Esther to intervene on behalf of their fellow Jews, all of that occurs leading right up to the time of Pesach. It says in the Megillah that this happened in mid-Nisan, when Passover takes place. But the Megillah is oblivious, but seemingly, on the face of it, seemingly oblivious to the fact that all of this is happening during Passover. So Ecclesiastes Rabbah, another rabbinic work of Midrash, citing this verse from Ecclesiastes, says, and the verse says, one who observes a commandment will encounter no bad thing. The rabbis midrashically interpret that verse to refer to Esther, who was ignorant. She apparently hadn't heard of Haman's decree. Mordechai had to tell Esther all about it. So she was ignorant of Haman's evil decree because she was busy with the commandment to do away with chametz leading up to Passover. Again, there's no mention of Passover. There's no mention of any Jewish holiday within the Megillah. Certainly no mention of Pesach, of Passover, and the events of the Megillah, by their own terms, very unselfconsciously talk about Esther giving instructions to the Jews to fast which would have encompassed the time that they should have been having their seders. And the rabbis talk about that as well, trying to reconcile the plain sense of the Megillah, in which Esther gives instructions to the Jews to fast at a time that they were supposed to be engaged in, eating matzah and maror as part of their Seder observance. The Megillah is oblivious to Pesach, but in the world, in the minds of the rabbis, Esther becomes a more religiously observant Jewess within the confines of the non-Jewish palace. Finally, the rabbis of the Talmud, I think, really in their sequencing of the Jewish canon, I think this was sort of the dispositive point that they tried to make about where Esther fit in. They were uncomfortable with the plain sense of the theology, the diasporic theology reflected in the book. And so they said, and this generally goes chronologically, but as I mentioned, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, referred to here by the single term Ezra, the events were really concurrent with Megillat Esther. And so in theory, Ezra could have preceded Esther in the canon, but it does not. It says Daniel and the Scroll of Esther, and then the order is Ezra and the book of Chronicles, which is from a later period, making clear that from the rabbinic perspective, centuries later, as embodied and codified in the Talmud, the perspective that is reflected in the book of Ezra will be the last thing you read. It will sort of soften the blow of reading the book of Esther, in which God is not even mentioned. There's no reference to returning to the land. There's no focus on the temple, on Jerusalem, on the Davidic dynasty, on Jewish ritual practices. So if you read the book of Esther and you're discomforted by all of those omissions, don't worry, you'll get to the book of Ezra, in which the more conventional, traditional perspective is evident. I mentioned earlier, and this is a larger topic that I'll just broach quickly. There, in addition to the traditional Hebrew text of Megillat Esther, there were also Greek Jewish, so these were Jews who wrote Greek versions of the Megillah, and they were likely, even though they were written in Greek, they were likely written in the land of Israel. Those Greek variants make Esther and make the Megillah more generally much more traditionally Jewish. So here in our traditional text, where it says, "But Esther still did not reveal her ancestry or her people to the king, as Mordecai had instructed her," in the Greek Jewish variant, it adds, "as Mordecai had instructed her, to fear God and to do his commandments." And it ends by saying, "So Esther did not change her way of life when she moved into the palace." So the Greek Jewish variant of Megillat Esther, that almost none of us have access to linguistically anymore, but that did circulate within the ancient Jewish world, makes clear that Mordecai had instructed Esther to be a good young Jew, to observe the commandments. That language and those themes are absent from our traditional text. Another example of that, this is the context in which King Achashverosh couldn't sleep, and he read the chronicles of the king, and there discovered that Mordecai had saved his life. And that really shifted the story in Mordecai's favor against Haman. Our text says that night sleep deserted the king. The more religious Greek variant says, "But the mighty one," meaning God, "kept sleep from the king that night." So the Greek Jewish variant is a much more traditionally and biblically Jewish perspective of God orchestrating the events explicitly. So even if that's a part of reading our version of Esther, at best that's an implicit presence of God. I want to turn now to what has really been, in terms of navigating the politics of Jews living in the diaspora, perhaps the thorniest issue we have faced historically, and we continue to face, an accusation of dual loyalty that causes us to be unreliable citizens of whatever community in the diaspora that we live in. That dual loyalty accusation, I think, finds its first source in the book of Esther, in the Megillah, where Haman says to King Achashverosh, "There is a certain people," meaning the Jews, "scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them." That leads to his evil scheme to annihilate those disloyal citizens of the Persian Empire. So that dual loyalty accusation, I think, finds its place in the Megillah for the first time in any literature. But it wasn't the last time that Jews had to face that accusation. And I think the Megillah makes clear that Haman was a genuine anti-Semite. He's described as a hater of the Jews. So I think one can trace anti-Semitism in the diaspora to Megillat Esther as well. But a few centuries later, the famous Philo of Alexandria, so he was writing in Egypt, he also felt a need to rebut the accusation of Jewish dual loyalty. And in that book, he wrote, "For no one country can contain the whole Jewish nation by reason of its populousness." That's debatable about how ever in history Jews were too populous to be containable within one country. On which account, he's trying to explain why Jews are so dispersed all over the world, on which account they frequent all the most prosperous and fertile countries of Europe and Asia, looking indeed upon the holy city, meaning Jerusalem, as their metropolis, meaning their mother city, in which is erected the sacred temple. He's writing at a time that the second temple was still standing, but accounting those regions in the diaspora, which have been occupied by their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and still more remote ancestors, dating back perhaps centuries, in which they have been born and brought up, meaning in the diaspora, as their country. So Philo is trying to rebut the accusation of dual loyalty by saying, look, Jews do look to Jerusalem and to the land of Israel as their mother homeland, but they are still faithful to the places, to the diaspora communities in which they find themselves, and where they have been raised, sometimes for centuries at a time. I'm nearing the end of my source sheet. I want to talk for a few minutes about Mordechai and the symbolism of his presence in the diaspora. This is near the beginning of the Megillah, where Mordechai is introduced, and there are at least a couple things I want to highlight here. It says, in the fortress, or in the fortified city of Shushan, that was the capital of the Persian Empire, lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, Ish Yehudi Haya Beshushan Habira, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And it goes on to say that Kish, one of Mordechai's answers, had been exiled within the initial group of exiles along with the king of Judah, when they had been exiled by the Babylonians. So it gives his sort of pedigree. Yes, he's in the diaspora because he comes from a sort of a privileged group of Jews who unfortunately had been exiled, long before this time by the Babylonians. But the two things I want to highlight is that Mordechai is referred to as a Yehudi, which in prior periods of Jewish history would have meant simply a Judean, meaning a person who lived in the geographic province of Judea, in the land of Israel, because that's where all Jews lived after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you lived in Judea, you were a Yehudi, a person from Yehuda, a Judean. But here, this reflects a transition of what Yehudi means. I think one could argue that in the Megillah, and maybe perhaps starting in a slightly later period, Yehudi actually comes to mean Jew, and that's how it's translated. So there's a transition from Yehudi, meaning Judean, to meaning Jew, because Mordechai clearly was no longer living in the geographic province of Judea in the land of Israel. So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight, that with the Jewish presence in the diaspora came a new sense of Jewish identity, that you no longer had to live in Judea to be called a Yehudi. You could be a descendant of those people living in far-flung communities of the diaspora, but still called a Yehudi, which became unmoored. It was no longer tied to a geographic identity, but was a religious or ethnic identity attached to Jews living all over the world. So that's the first significant issue that the Megillah makes clear. And the second is that he was a Benjaminite, Mordechai. He was from and that relates. Knowledgeable Jewish readers of the Megillah would know that means Mordechai was related to King Saul, not to King David, who was from the tribe of Judah. And that was significant too, that he was from the tribe of Benjamin, Ish Yemini, from the tribe of Benjamin, not from the tribe of Judah. That is a different, there's a reoriented focus on Jews who were not necessarily of the Davidic dynasty, who could be saviors of the people Israel. I want to highlight the conclusion of the Megillah that we'll read on the holiday. It's a very prosaic and mundane conclusion that is, I would say, is not typical of the Jewish biblical canon. It says, and what could be more mundane than taxes? It says that the Megillah ends with saying, King Achashverosh imposed a tax on the mainland and the islands of the sea. And his story and the story of Mordechai's advancement was written in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. For Mordechai, the Jew, was second to King Achashverosh, great among the Jews. He was well received by the majority of his brethren. It says, Veratsui lerov echav, seeking favor for his people and advocating for the welfare of all his kindred. So it's a very mundane ending to the Megillah. I would argue, reflecting that the author of the Megillah and the Jews described within it had no sense that their life, their existence within the diaspora and the often fragile circumstances and tenuous circumstances in which they live, that life would go on. There's no sense that they thought it was going to end soon, that they wanted it to end soon. The Persian Empire seemed almost eternal, enduring for at least a couple centuries. And Jews, the Megillah makes clear that there's no plan here for any return to the homeland. It's a mundane ending. There's no mention of God. There's no gratitude to God expressed at the end of the book. And I italicize these words because the rabbis later picked up on it. And the rabbis of the Talmud express some ambivalence even about Mordechai, the hero of the Megillah. And they cite what I just read. For Mordechai, the Jew was second to King Achashverosh, great among the Jews and accepted by the majority of his brethren. The Gemara comments, only by the majority of his brethren, but not by all his brethren. V'lo lechol echav. This teaches that some members of the Sanhedrin, Mordechai was thought to be a member of the Sanhedrin, some members of the Sanhedrin separated from him. And the implication is because Mordechai was too political in nature. He was too engrossed with politics. That came at the expense of the time he invested in learning and teaching Torah, that he should have been more involved in the activities of the Sanhedrin, more connected to the world of Torah, and perhaps less engrossed in the politics of the diaspora. One could ask, well, Mordechai could have responded, well, I needed to save the Jews in order for the Torah to have continued relevance for anyone. Jews need to be alive in order for the tradition to have any consequence or relevance. But there is some ambivalence about the political nature of Mordechai's activities as reflected in rabbinic writings. I'm going to end up with just some comments about the relationship of the book of Esther and the story of Joseph that we read about in the book of Genesis. I think it's clear that there are parallels that Megillat Esther wants us to draw between Mordechai and Joseph. And I'll just state some of them. They were both courtiers, both important people in a foreign court. Joseph was important both in the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official, and then, as we know, became the viceroy of Egypt, the second in command of all of Egypt. So that's a parallel in that they were both involved in sort of foreign politics. They were both arguably quite assimilated Mordechai, again, I've discussed about how there really is no reference to Jewish ritual or Jewish piety in the Megillah. In the story of Joseph, he gets an Egyptian name. He marries an Egyptian woman. He gives his sons names that reflect his disattachment from his Jewish past. So Joseph was quite assimilated, like Mordechai was. And there are also various coincidences reflected in both the Megillah and in the Joseph story that lead to the ultimate salvation of and the improved circumstances of Jews. But there's a major difference between the story of Joseph and the Megillah. When Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers, after they haven't seen him for many years, he says, "Come forward to me." And he told them, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you." And Joseph played a key role in navigating the circumstances of the famine. And he tells his brothers, "God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So, brothers, don't feel guilty. It was not you who sent me here, but God. God has done all this." So the Joseph story, despite the assimilationist features of the story that parallel the Megillah, ultimately, Joseph is very explicitly says, by the way, God was behind all of this. Don't feel so bad, brothers. God was the architect, the engineer of all of these events. And so, you brothers are sort of off the hook. That religious explicit mention of God is absent from the Megillah. But then it as the aftermath to the appendix to the Joseph story, as we transition from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus, there really is a chilling transition, and one that I think should resonate with all of us living in the diaspora. So whereas Joseph was the second in command in Egypt, and the book of Genesis ends on a happy note, just like the Megillah ends on a happy note, it moves then, the Jewish Bible moves then into the book of Exodus. And early in the book of Exodus, we read, "Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef." A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So there's a huge caveat that we discover in the book of Exodus, that Jewish safety in the diaspora really is only as valuable as the life of the guarantor of that safety. So when there was a new king who was no longer the king who in whose eyes Joseph had found favor, the safety of the Jews was all of a sudden very fragile, and as we know, became very embittered. So that Exodus makes clear that the existence of Jews in the diaspora is fragile, is tenuous, is reliant on unstable, erratic, volatile foreign leaders who can either die or can change their mind about the Jews. And that fraught existence, whereas Genesis ends on a happy note, the fraught existence of the Jews in a foreign land in the book of Exodus is terribly frightening. The Megillah ends on a happy note, but a reader of the Jewish Bible could think, yes, Mordechai and Esther, through a series of coincidences and through their own shrewd activities, helped save the Jews. But what about, as Rabbi Greenberg noted at the beginning of my source sheet, what if those coincidences never took place? Or what if the king of Persia changed his mind about whether the Jews should be saved? Those uncertainties about being within the control of foreign leadership is very disconcerting. And this move in Exodus to a new terrifying existence for Jews in a foreign land, really, I think it casts a shadow over the ending of the Megillah, despite its happiness. What about if there were another chapter written after the conclusion of the Megillah in which it said, a new king arose over Persia who did not know Mordechai? The circumstances of the Jews in diaspora would take a very different and unwelcome turn. I'm going to end with this quote from an article that I found that I think really captures very well many of the themes that I've been discussing about the Megillah. What is more surprising is that some stories about living in diaspora, such as the Megillah, are not about returning to the homeland or fighting back against their oppressors, but about remaining in exile and making the most of that situation, the dream of remain. Of all the scrolls, Esther is the most explicit illustration of the dream of remain. There is no mention in the book of Esther of the most obvious diaspora dream, the more conventional biblical aspiration, that of return to the homeland. There's no talk of Esther of fleeing or going back to the promised land, only a concern with living safely in Persia. Living openly and freely as Jews in a foreign land is the dream, and in the book of Esther, that dream is realized. Esther's message is that remain, staying put but safely, is a worthy dream. I think that really captures a lot of the themes that I think we should draw from the Megillah, both the seeming prosperity of the Jews, but also for the fragility of living in fraught circumstances under foreign rule. I'm going to end with this. This is a famous panel in the ancient Dura Europus synagogue, the ruins of which are in Syria. They're supposedly still in a Syrian museum. They've been documented in other sources, but the actual remains, I think, are still there. Dura Europus was a diaspora synagogue in the eastern part of Syria, so in the eastern part of the Jewish diaspora from the 3rd century. And this is what's referred to as the Esther panel. This is a panel depicting events from the Megillah. This is Haman leading Mordechai on the horse. This is King Achashverosh. Queen Esther is here. So this is clearly meant to depict events from the Megillah. And this, and by the way, this is a painting by a 19th century Yale someone involved in the exhibition to excavate the remains of this Dura Europa synagogue, who painted the panel, so you can see some of these the figures more clearly. But this occupied a very prestigious place in the synagogue. It is right next to the niche in which the scroll of the Torah was kept. So essentially where the ark was, and right to the left of it is this panel, which I think reflects the fact that at least in this diaspora community, the book of Megillat Esther was beloved. They could relate to this story of Jews navigating the fragile and fraught circumstances of living in a diaspora outside of their homeland, where their future existence was uncertain, but all they could do was their best to try to survive and prosper from day to day. It was given a place of privilege in that synagogue. And I'll end there and give a final comment just to try to answer, perhaps give a thought about the answer to my question. Is the diaspora good or bad for the Jews? I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that I think we have to thank God for the fact that there are smart, forward-thinking Jews in various diaspora communities all around the world who are advocating for the welfare of Jews both in those communities and for Israel, for our people's homeland. Thank God that we have Jews in important places with access to political power, both for our sake and for our brethren in Israel. I know that that is the case today, where in the fraught circumstances after October 7th, we are dependent on the goodwill of political leaders beyond our our direct control, with respect to whom we could hope to have some input and some influence. And thank God for that access to power. Israel could use all the help it could muster. So at least from that perspective, it's a good thing that we have Jews in the diaspora, that we're not all centralized in one place, because I'm not sure that if we, because as I mentioned, we all have the option of moving to Israel. We have a homeland, a political homeland now, but perhaps Jews everywhere are better off with having Jews not centralized exclusively in one place, and with Jews in the diaspora to do their best to help those Jewish communities, as well as the state of Israel, survive and flourish. So I'll end with that, Rabbi.
Sure. Oh, Mark, really fantastic. On the front of how do we deal with such a a nefarious plot by a total anti-Semite and the beginning of anti-Semitism, and get ourselves all uh, partied up and costumed up and make such a bang up party out of it all. Dr. David Lieber, who was a pretty serious Bible scholar out in California, who was the editor of our Eitz Chaim Chumash, used to say that it's a way of Jewish reading, and that if you cannot, if you've survived that, and you read about it and survived that, then you just have to party. And he would say that in his very, very formal style. And I always remember him telling us, so party. And the piece I'll send you back to is, and let's leave aside for a minute the rabbis thinking about Esther and Mordecai in some fraught ways, because as it said at the end, as you said, not everybody loved Mordecai. The Gemara didn't love Mordecai, and even Ezra said, "Who can have universal 100% of the people, plugging for him?" Even Ezra, being a diaspora Jew himself, like, who could really expect to be universally loved? He said it's a very healthy ending, the Megillah. But the piece I want to send you back to is the Ezra piece. When it says in Ezra's prayer that he built up a Gader, do you think it more reflects the Philo kind of text that you brought forward, where we had this spiritual center? Solomon Schechter also spoke about it in our age, by the way, head of the seminary for a while, namesake of the school system by his name, that Jerusalem and the land of Israel in our Zionism and our diasporist, positive diasporist Zionist outlook, is that Jerusalem and Israel remains the center address for the Jews of many central addresses, New York community being one of them, and that the Gader was a fortification of sorts in a way that was spiritual already at that time, even though he was taking a group back that he was well aware Nehemiah was staying behind, and he was well aware that they were creating this kind of fortress central address for the inspiration it could provide people who would still have an expanded now border, as it is physically, more even spiritually. So do you think that you could find that in that vocabulary of Gader?
But perhaps, Rabbi, I think it's unclear, because Ezra may have simply been a pragmatic sort of accommodator of reality. And the book of Ezra makes clear that, as I mentioned, it was a minority of Jews who returned to Judea, to the homeland. Ezra knew that. Nehemiah, interestingly, left his high position in the Persian court to come back to the homeland, and to help the Jews in that way. So it could have been simply a pragmatic concession to reality, that Ezra perhaps thought that Jews should return, but that for whatever reasons, many Jews or most Jews did not. So aspirationally, Ezra and Nehemiah perhaps wanted Jews to have that Zionist sense of returning to the homeland and helping to rebuild the Jerusalem and the land of Israel that way, as opposed to remaining where they were in the diaspora. I think it's clear that there were the Hasmoneans, for example, later on. There were people, Jews who lived in Judea, in the land of Israel, who clearly thought that Jews shouldn't really be in the diaspora, that they should return to Israel. And at minimum, if they were going to stay in the diaspora, they should subordinate their interests and direct their attention and religiously and spiritually to Israel. So I think you're right, but it might reflect sort of a concession to reality as opposed to an ideal aspiration for what they had in mind for Jews to do. I think there were a variety of perspectives about whether Jews were obligated to return to the homeland, and did they have to justify themselves if they did not. I think Megillat Esther reflects a sort of unself-conscious view that no, Jews, we can stay in the diaspora. Perhaps Jews overall are better off if we have Jews in high places in the diaspora, which may be true today. So I think there's a spectrum of views. So you may be right about Ezra. It's not clear to me whether ideally they wanted Jews to come back or not.
Mark, I really appreciate, our being able to delve into this through this kind of, moment here of Purim, where we are today with the turn of government in New York. I spent the day at a hearing of the Committee on Hate in the New York City Town Hall regarding Julie Menon's 5-point plan to address houses of worship, Jewish safety, right the record when it comes to the corruption in Holocaust education, try to formulate a way to plan on teaching a little bit more, let's say, pluralism and tolerance and commitment to religious freedom. At the same time, we have commitment to free speech in America. And it was very obvious that the vitriolic hate and the anti-Semitic canards and the call for allowing for public shaming towards even violent reactions to Jewish institutions hosting Nefesh B'Nefesh and other land sales in Israel, not only over any borders, but in the stolen lands. It was obvious that those people forced their way into this city hall today, and they were going to keep testifying until midnight in order to make their points. And with no one calling out, really, the canards as such and the poisonous and vitriolic hate that we heard, but hope that their testimony in very calm and reassuring ways that Jews were about the commitments to the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom of worship would overcome those kinds of spewings of poison. And so I make everybody aware of that today. That is a very timely subject matter, as the administration has changed. And
I mean, Rabbi, I think all of this, I do believe, has very genuine and direct relevance to our circumstances today. The question of how to respond to anti-Semitic attacks and accusations, as you know, very committed Jews have different views of how we should invest resources in responding, whether we should engage with those types of people, how we combat anti-Semitism, what is the best policy going forward in terms of spending money and investing time and effort. And I don't know that there's a clear solution. Maybe things have to be done on various fronts and using various strategies. But it's a very timely and consequential issue.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I know it's getting late, Mark. You want to take a few questions?
Sure, absolutely.
All right, folks. Questions away. Charlie, I see your
Charlie
hand.
has a hand up.
Okay. with regard to the diaspora, with regard to the lack of mention of God in Esther, I think it's Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, who who writes about the still small voice, and that's taken to indicate that God is backing away to give Israel, his people, space, and even in the Torah in Bereshit, God is down on earth with Adam, but slowly he backs away. There's nobody like Moses anymore where he had a close connection to Moses, but Moses never really saw God in any kind of form. I'm not sure how Adam saw God, but so God backing away. So is Esther that endpoint? Is Esther represent the prophet? I think it's Ezekiel's point that there's still a small voice there, but it keeps backing away, and more of the people are running Judaism without God taking up as much space as he once did.
Yeah, I think, Charlie, I think that's a fair way of looking at it. I think the Megillah is an extreme representation of that perspective within the Jewish Bible. The Megillah represents what scholars refer to as a disenchanted world. There are no prophets in the Megillah. There are no obvious miracles. Again, Rabbi, I know you and your family like the saying, "Is it odd or is it God?" And that's sort of the traditional way of reading the Megillah. That there's no mention of God, but we know that God was acting behind the scenes and helping to orchestrate. Um, but it nevertheless, the Megillah is an anomaly because it doesn't have a reference to God. There's no obvious reference to to traditional Jewish themes, and so I think you're right that it represents um, the reality within the diaspora. The Jews have to rely on themselves and rely on the best of us and rely on our most tactical and prudent and thoughtful ways to approach power and politics to ensure our safety and prosperity. Because the Megillah makes clear God may or may not be present or absent. You don't know. The fact that the God is not mentioned in the Megillah may mean that God is hidden, or God is absent, or God is inoperative in the Persian Empire. Who knows what it means about the Megillah's perspective on God? But clearly, and this is true, by the way, in the Torah too, clearly human beings have to take some initiative um, in order for even arguably a divine presence to be brought into the world. And that's absolutely true of the Megillah. Human beings take, front and center stage. God is at best behind the scenes. And so, yeah, I think it's the clearest embodiment of that perspective.
Matt, I see a hand.
You see a hand. Hi, thank you, Mark. This is really great. I tuned in a few minutes late, but I got most of it, and it's really there's a lot of material that gets us thinking. How privileged we are to be in the times of a Jewish state, um, but the current government of the Jewish state has a very troubled relationship with the diaspora and it's a question of how we in the diaspora who are not yet in the land of Israel are to be taken seriously as Jews who observe a little differently, a la Esther, and to be taken seriously in the political calculations and the governing calculations of the state of Israel. So that point I'm also seeing
Yeah,
there.
Matt, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's an exact parallel to I think you're certainly right that the relationship between Israel, its people, its government and communities in the diaspora is a really important one where Jews are still trying to figure that out. And there's an exact parallel to the times of Megillat Esther, in which Jews who did go back to the homeland had very interesting communications with Jews in the diaspora, sometimes trying to encourage or persuade them to move back to the homeland, sometimes recognizing that Jews in the diaspora could advocate on behalf of Judaism more generally in ways that were helpful. So I think you're right that this is 2,500 years later, but we're still trying to figure out the same complex circumstances. I can't see any other hands, but
I don't see another hand. I think we have a great comment in the in the comment section in the chat, so everybody could read that. If you don't have your chat up, I suggest that you just go down below and click on the chat. Mark, let me thank you as the hour is getting late, and say that would love to continue the conversation as always. We'll make the recording available and Mark's source sheet so you can look back through and study again. Catch Mark for questions. Start a dialogue about all this. The Purim party is gonna get going on Sunday, where Elise Nagel has been rounding up the little kids, is throwing a party for the community from 3 to 5 at Or Zarua. So come for Shabbat and all that, but there's a Purim party on Sunday, and we're trying to make it multi-generational, and even need a few faces from the community to say hi to all these new families that are hanging around Or Zarua. Monday night is Purim itself, where you'll hear the Megillah, and you'll have time to think about all this again. Come in a costume, make it riotous and fun, and hey, we survived all this Mishugas, and we will survive it again. And it's a great time to express our connections communally and towards Am Yisrael Chai, and the kind of koach we need if God's not going to come swooping down and raise a hand to take us out of our messes, right? So that's the thrill of Purim. In the morning, by the way, we have a nice Purim banquet, and she's not here, so I'll tell you that Purim morning, it's Amy's birthday. So you'll even get not only pancakes and eggs for breakfast after the Megillah reading, but you'll get a birthday cake. So that's that. I want to pitch a few more Wednesdays. I would love to have this big a group every Wednesday in March. Here's what's on the docket. My next Talmud class is Wednesday. It's called One Too Many L'chaims, Boozing and Bruising in Masechet Megillah. So we'll learn a sugya about that ad de lo yada, drinking too much in the Talmud, and a lot of boozing they did, those two rabbis who wound up in a crazy moment at Purim time. And then spilling the beans to this learning community. We have 3 amazing Wednesday nights after that. Rabbi Wexler will be in town to give a lecture that he's been working on for quite some time on March 11th. The next week, Benjamin Marcus will be presenting illuminated Megillot in person in the Or Zarua Beit Midrash. He has done both Megillat Esther and Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs that we read at Pesach. So you must come see these beautiful works of art and let him tell you about why he chose to draw and illuminate how he did and illustrate how he did. And then at the end of March, Charles Scheidt. Charlie is a member who wrote an amazing Holocaust survival to thriving in the diaspora tale, to bring it all back around to what Mark taught tonight. And Owen Pell will be in dialogue with Charlie. So Wednesdays at Or Zarua over the next weeks, in addition to all the other great opportunities to be together for sacred services and reasons. Please.
Can I just end with and my class will continue in the spring, or will start in the spring, continue from year to year. I hope many, or all of you will join me for a series of lectures on Jewish perspectives on the problem of evil, which relates to some of the issues we discussed tonight. And finally, I'll just say, I hope tonight's talk and our discussion afterwards will make people think, a little in new ways about the Megillah, and about, I think, the serious themes that it presents for Jewish existence in today's world.
My last word, Mark, was going to be that there's no more important questions right now for the existence in the Jewish world than those you've brought forward. And to find the ability to really be a partying Jew after October 7, given the status of Jewish communal life in New York, we have to find the power to create a joyful Judaism despite all of the threats around us and the potentials that exist for really making a go of beautifying diaspora existence at the same time we really love and support and connect to Eretz Yisrael. Thank
So,
you.
Thank you,
Fantastic.
everyone.
Mark.
Thank you.
Mark.
Fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
My
much,
pleasure.
Mark. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Happy
Thank you.
Purim to everyone.
Wonderful.
Katzameach.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
My
So well
pleasure.
prepared. Wonderful. Rabbi, we're also going to have Barbara Wolf coming
Sunday. That's right.
Sunday, March
On-
8th, and we're going to get notification of it. It's going to be a wonderful talk also about illumination and illustration.
That's right. You are so right, Bobby. So we'll definitely.
So I
get
hope
word out
everybody
around about it.
online will look for that and come and listen to her. She's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
Andy and who? Who was that? Is that his